Welcome back, everyone, for the final panel of today on the role of the UK in the Indo-Pacific and British foreign policy as relates to the Indo-Pacific. I should say at the outset, unfortunately, one of our panelists has been unable to make it today due to the timing of the announcement of the general election. Catherine West, Labour MP for Hornsey and Wood Green, and Shadow Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific had to cancel yesterday evening at short notice. So we apologize for that, although of course we also understand. So today we are very lucky to have as our panel three excellent speakers. The first is Mark Logan, who's Conservative MP for Bolton North East and has a considerable degree of experience and expertise on diplomacy and foreign policy in Asia and the Pacific, notably in Shanghai, if I remember correctly, right? You're the Consulate General there. And he'll speak first. After him, we have Dr. Winnie King from the University of Bristol, who has also a lot of experience working in government. And then finally, Dr. Katherine Jones of the University of St. Andrews, who actually spans both Northeast and Southeast Asia with a considerable degree of expertise. So I'll turn the floor over first to Mark, and then Winnie, and then Kath.
Thank you so much for the invitation today. And I think it's really funny, actually, that I'm here and Catherine's not, because when I was told that 20 minutes ago, I couldn't believe it, because she's a Labour MP in a London constituency. So, the election's probably going to be not too bad for her. Whereas my majority is 378, and then the third, I'm number 2 or number 3 on the Labour hit list. So maybe that's what she's doing. Maybe she's watching this live, and then she's going to send it to my constituents and say he's not in his constituency and he's in Cambridge with all the posh people, like that. But. No, it's great. It is great. It is great being here. And funny, and I was saying to both my other panelist friends today that unlike most of the time when I've been in Parliament just for the last 4.5 years, I actually read my briefing today. And usually doesn't happen because you just get a stampede of emails coming through each and every day, and then Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific. To what extent do my constituents care about that? That's a big question mark. I'm not going to answer this right now, but. The House of Commons Library, they do, wonderful research for MPs that aren't really expert on different topics from time to time. But I'm just conscious that it was probably Winnie that wrote that piece of research, because you were based there. You're still there. You've gone on. So Winnie was there for a good period of time, and so a lot of the stuff that I was reading on Indo-Pacific, or indeed specifically on China, was coming from Winnie. So whenever we were asked who would go first, I said me, because I was the third person speaking on this panel. I had nothing else to say by the end of it. So that's a tip. So on Indo-Pacific, I think I'll try not to speak at too much of a length, because I'm conscious that you always learn much more from a Q&A session than you do from politicians spouting at you for 15, 20 minutes. I think that obviously the UK has, and through the government where I'm a parliamentary private secretary too, over the course of the last number of years, we've taken an increasing interest in Asia Pacific. I say that with the slight qualification that a few nights ago in the House of Lords, there was a gentleman did come up to me. I was giving a talk on China specifically that evening, and for some reason we got talking about PISA scores, and how wonderful Shanghai has always done on the PISA rankings. They're number 1 or top 3 places in the world. And I said, well, I remember in 2012, and I can see Dan Chug here from the Foreign Office as well. At that time, we had a quick succession of ministers coming through to the China network, who were trying to learn all sorts of things from China, especially how to teach mathematics and sciences. And I thought at that time, 10 years ago, that this was a wonderful thing, and it was very avant-garde. But the gentleman I met a couple of nights ago in the House of Lords, he said that, no, we were doing that 25 years ago. So perhaps during a Labour government under Tony Blair at the time, so perhaps this interest in Indo-Pacific isn't something which is just necessarily new, but I do think that in recent years it's gained a lot more publicity. It's gained a lot more attention, I think, within the press and also within Parliament. Also, The integrated review that we had in 2021 did talk at great length about the Indo-Pacific. I note that, again, in the House of Commons Library research, that it talked about how the naming of Indo-Pacific was chosen very explicitly, as opposed to using Asia-Pacific in that case, because of the increasing importance of India in the region. And then following on from 2021, we had the refresh in 2023, and one of the big central tenets of that refresh was, of course, the slight change on language when it came to China. So obviously, as a government, we've taken a huge interest. We've seen in recent years the AUKUS deal between Australia, the United States, and the UK. Perhaps henceforth on Pillar 2, Japan, for example, may become an increasingly interested partner in that AUKUS security arrangement. We've also had bilateral developments between UK and Japan, also including Italy, when it comes to procurement of aircrafts, and CPTPP, which, of course, we just in recent months have had that go through the House of Commons, and there's a number of countries already in the CPTPP of the 11 members that have already ratified the UK's accession to that, and there's a number of countries that we're waiting on, hopefully by the end of 2024, that will be the case. I think on some of the detractors when it comes to CPTPP have talked about how they don't think in the short term, this period of time, that there's going to be a huge increase in the number of percentage of trade volume between the UK and members of the CPTPP, because, for example, we already have bilateral trading agreements with some of the pre-existing countries there. But in the long term, at the very least, I think both in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, we've seen the accession to the CPTPP as something which is of geopolitical benefit to us, and showing that we have an increasing role and voice, interest, capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. What I'll finish on before passing over to one of our other panelists is just obviously, genuinely disappointed. Actually, Katherine isn't here, because Katherine and myself this year, we've been on a number of trips overseas. Earlier on the year, one to Japan on the UK-Japan 21st Century Leadership Forum. So a bit of a mouthful, and John's been on that many times previously. And also we visited China just about 68 weeks ago, 2 months ago. And, I must admit, I hope this isn't live, or I hope this is Chatham House rules. I'm going to say something nice about a Labour. Is it? Katherine, I was going to say something nice about you. But Katherine, from experience of watching Katherine in action, I think that, if she's unfortunately unsuccessful at becoming the real Asia Minister in this general election, I'm sure in parliaments to come, is that she has a lot to offer. Because I've watched her in action in diplomacy. I think she's very thoughtful. She has a genuine interest. She's lived in the region. She spent time in China, Nanjing, during the 1990s. Actually, every time I've been on a foreign trip with her, she's always had Duolingo. And she's, no matter which country it is, she's been trying to learn as much of the language as possible before she lands there. So that's great to see. We like a wee bit of technocracy in government as well, not just pure politics. But I think it'll be interesting to see what a Labour government in the future would do vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific, because I think it all comes down to what we as a country in the United Kingdom, what we see as our role in the world, what's our identity, how do we relate to other countries, and then obviously, aside from to what extent do you have the will to operate in the region, I think the capability question is a big one also, again, because you've seen lots of debates in recent months, and indeed the last couple of years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Some people would say that the political, military, diplomatic, commercial wind of the United Kingdom always blows from Europe, and therefore we should have more of an interest in European affairs. And if we're not a global superpower compared to where we were 100 years ago, do we have to reckon with our own capabilities and make choices? I should be doing party political stuff now, shouldn't I? Talk about global Britain, but I'm not going to do that. I'll pass over to who's next on the Winnie as well. So thank you very much for that. I look forward to your questions in a wee bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to reference, the Indo-Pacific stuff was written by my colleagues, not by me. So, but it is quality. China stuff, yes. I think what I'm going to do is just build upon what Mark has said, and really to bring home several key things that have been mulling about in discussions that I've had with a number of people. Because ultimately what we're talking about is UK foreign policy in Indo-Pacific, Asia Pacific, however you want to label it. And it's ultimately very much framed by the current integrated view refresh in terms of identifying the, align, protect, and engage. And wonderful concepts, the issue becomes a matter of where is the nuance? How would we do that? Do we have the means to do that? And what are our hierarchy of priorities in order to achieve those things? And whichever government we may have, whether Labour or Conservative, it becomes important to really understand adopting a strategy that is clear about what not just what we want, but what we need and what we're willing to sacrifice in order to get those things and what we're not willing to sacrifice, because the risks that come with action as well as inaction are, are real. And so if we look just at the China policy, the UK's China policy, it becomes quite apparent that there are concerns about how things will be actualized and what it is that we really want to achieve. Whether if we don't do anything, stagnation becomes a problem, because it's a very fast-moving geopolitical situation in the Indo-Pacific, whether we're talking about supply chains and critical minerals, whether we're talking about technology and cyber and standardization in rules and regulations around AI, or if we're talking about the changing dynamics around the West's relationship with the global South, right? There is clearly scope for the UK to engage in the Indo-Pacific on multiple levels in a very successful way, not just in terms of the fact that we have a history with a lot of these nation states and these economies, and that we have reasonable or significant diplomatic clout on the international stage. We have reputation and soft power in the area of whether it's legal systems or insurance and risk compliance, all that kind of stuff, which necessarily comes to play when we're talking about international trade, public-private partnerships in major infrastructural projects, that kind of thing, energy, excuse me. Debates about how we would achieve that inherently come to the foreground when it comes to how the UK sees itself when it comes to its foreign policy. And last year we had a big discussion about the idea of the UK and whether or not, what its position is on the international stage. And a big discussion came out about whether or not the UK would accept the fact or potential fact that it is a middle power, right? Canada's a middle power. I'm from Canada. So Canada's a middle power, and diplomatically, on the international stage, it doesn't have a lot of pull, but as a middle power, it does diplomatically still have a lot of potential for sway and influence. And there are certain sectors it identifies which it could be very effective in, and it also has a habit to work with other nation states to collaborate and to cooperate, to identify where they have areas in common to achieve the things that they want to achieve if they on their own could not do that. And I think that's quite that's an option that could be available for the UK if we're willing to do that, because that's the big thing. There has to be that desire and that motivation. I think the last thing, two last things that I think is quite important if we're talking about issues of national security, which we talked a lot about in the last panel, whether it's national security or economic security, and that's the point that how we want to achieve these things have to be realistic in terms of whether or not we have the capability and the capacity to do it. So it does require money, it does require commitment, and they have to be, these kinds of things need to be depoliticized to the point where, irrespective of what foreign minister may be foreign secretary may be in power, the FCO, FCDO can continue the objectives of the UK's foreign policy, even if that changes, right? Because changing winds in politics can be problematic, but there needs to be a level of stability and consistency within foreign policy. And the last thing is that, and I think it's quite important that as a means to achieve these things, maybe opening up our minds and ourselves to new alliances or new communications and engagement. So I do Chinese political economy, international relations, but I also do Taiwan and cross-strait relations. And there's a lot we can learn from Taiwan when it comes to how it engages with China, because Taiwan has the world's largest trade surplus with China compared to any other economy. And that's particularly interesting considering the geopolitical context, right? And so there's a rationale behind that. And there's a basis upon which this has happened. At the same time, Taiwan has positioned itself that when it comes to issues of telecoms, like internet and stuff, that kind of stuff, it has also prioritized a national security perspective where it does not have any Chinese tech in its telecoms. And so finding that balance is a nuanced thing that I think the UK could learn from. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn on my timer just so that I don't waffle for forever. Thank you to Bill and to my fellow panellists for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. And I would say thank you to the hugely intimidating audience that is in front of us this afternoon, which is one reason why I want to make sure I don't waffle forever, because I'm sure there's a lot of comments and thoughts in the room that are going to be very interesting in Q&A. And I'll obviously pass all difficult questions to my fellow panellists. I'm going to be a little bit more bold than Winnie and say in the Indo-Pacific, the UK is a middle power. That is a geographically grounded statement. We can argue later about whether globally it is a great power or not, or what the characteristics of that status are. Second, in the Indo-Pacific, the UK is a guest, not a homeowner. The choice is it a welcome guest, or is it the guest that turned up at 2 o'clock in the morning, hungover and wanting some food? And I think we are at a moment where we are at a tipping point of the UK being a welcome guest that brings opportunities, parity, equity, opportunities for further development across the region, versus being that unwelcome, unhappy guest. One of the things that several members of the previous panel discussed in the discussion about economics is Southeast Asia doesn't want to have to choose. Southeast Asia has tremendous opportunities by being in the middle, by hedging. Southeast Asia being able to hedge economically also presents massive opportunities for the UK. And so not only is it not in the interests of Southeast Asia to be pushed into a position of choice, it isn't, I don't think, in the interests of the UK to be pushing Southeast Asia or any other states to choose between these two options of China or the United States. So I was thinking earlier today, how bold am I going to be? I think I've just set my stall. But one of the things that I was delighted that Mark started with is contextualising your engagement with the region. That both you and Catherine West and groups of parliamentarians, along with people in the room, spend a lot of time in the region. Because knowing the region on paper is not equivalent to knowing the region in reality. And knowing leads to engagement, not just at a state-to-state level, not just at a functional institutional level, but at a person-to-person level. And that is insurmountable in terms of how you continue and build relationships over the long term. And engagement leads to another concept that we played with in the two panels this morning around empathy. Engagement leads to empathy, not just at an automatic instant of feeling empathetic towards an individual, but engagement leads to the kinds of cognitive empathy that Astrid mentioned in the first panel and was picked up in the second panel. And I think through that general process, we get to a point where the UK becomes a welcome guest in the region and not the unwelcome guest at 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, I've told you a bit of a happy story there. I'm now going to say, I think the UK has some work to do to get to that point. And I've written this out several different ways, so goodness knows how it's coming out now. But I think there are basically 5 things that we can chunk up the UK's engagement into. The first one is capacity. Not just in terms of building aircraft with Japan and Italy, not just in terms of capacity to engage in supply chains, to embed ourselves within different supply chains, but also capacity in relation to what capacities does the UK have today in May 2024? What capacities will the UK have in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time? But also, what capacities is the UK going to lose if it doesn't get the engagement right now? So by not being fully embedded within the supply chains, by de-risking or decoupling or drawing back, what opportunities for future capacities are we going to miss out on in the long term? Now, that's not an easy question to answer, but I think we can sort of see the seeds around digital economies, which we mentioned briefly earlier this morning. But I think we also need to think about what other tools does the UK have to build capacity. There's a few people in the room who have expertise in maritime resources. So should the UK be deploying resources, not necessarily in the space of an aircraft carrier visit every 3 or 4 years, and not just 2 littoral ships that are bobbing about the place. I apologise to any members of the Navy who take on significant risks in being present in the region. But one of the stories that I got told 2 years ago was a very positive story around Hurricane Haiyan and the UK's engagement because it was present, that it could provide immediate humanitarian response that was hugely important to people within the Philippines, that has had a resonance over more than a decade. Is that the kind of maritime capacity that is not going to necessarily make a headline or a one-time story, but is creating an enduring narrative of what the UK can do as a welcome guest in the region? One of the positive stories that I think the UK has to tell is the slow burn of the long-term UK engagement with Japan that pre-existed the tilt, that pre-existed the integrated review, that started off burning somewhere around 2013, 2014. I'm looking to John for approximate nod of a date. It's been slow. It's been built over a long time. It isn't just based on interpersonal trust between 2 particular leaders who happened to have a drink together and got on at an interpersonal level. It has been built over institutional trust across the establishments, across the political systems, across changes in governments. And whatever the UK does, as we're moving towards an election in the UK, is we need to make sure that our engagement with the Indo-Pacific is institutional and embeds organizational institutional trust, not just interpersonal trust that can be gifted away when we change a minister. And finally, my final point on capacity is, I think what we've got at the moment is the weight of an elephant in terms of ambition, perched on top of a stiletto. There's an image for you to take away from today. Because it isn't that there is not a tremendous amount of knowledge, expertise, and resource in the parts of government, civil society, NGOs, businesses, to be able to deliver on UK engagement in the Indo-Pacific. It's that it needs vastly more resourcing in order to be able to achieve it. And that will be a task for whatever stripes the next government has to work out exactly what that capacity looks like. My second point is around time frame. I don't think the UK in the Indo-Pacific is something for a single government to achieve or two governments to achieve. I think it's about an enduring slow burn over decades to make sure that we are committed to this region. And again, building those networks of trust is fundamental to that. That leads to the concept of alignment. Winnie mentioned alignment in the context of the integrated review refresh. And we've had the comment of like-mindedness mentioned across several of the sessions today. But when we talk about like-mindedness, everybody has their own assumptions about what like-mindedness is. Do we mean like-mindedness in terms of democracy to democracy? The second panel today talked about human rights and how we achieve human rights and whose human rights we're talking about. What do we exactly mean by like-mindedness? And if we're going to align, that might mean that we need to be one of the benders in terms of what we're aligning to, and that there is a discussion around what are those absolute lines, as Winnie mentioned, and what can we adjust along the way. But I think there also needs to be a recognition that where we might be like-minded in certain aspects of our politics, domestic governance, overall objectives, assumptions around who adversaries are or could be or might be in the future, we also need to be aware that those like-minded states in terms of politics might be direct economic rivals, in that they are competing to also be the biggest providers of digital technology going forwards, that they are going to be the places that companies like Arm get bought up by. And so we might need to be more specific about not just saying we need to work out who our like-minded partners could be, but also where do we diverge from those like-minded partners, and how does that play out in that wider nexus of trust? What tools does the UK have to achieve this? One of the other things that was mentioned fleetingly this morning, because I scrolled it down, was something related to sanctions. I think in relation to specific parts of the region, the UK has overwhelming responsibilities and previous expertise. North Korea is one of those places. But as of March 2024, the panel of experts in the UN didn't get its mandate renewed. So what does that mean for the implementation of sanctions against North Korea? What does that mean for our overall UK approach towards dealing with North Korea as an issue? And I would emphasize that it is not that people haven't been creatively thinking about alternative ways to approach North Korea and provide solutions. But increasingly, we might be seeing the logic of sanctions as other parts of the international system break down or pull apart, means that the strategies that the UK and others have depended on are no longer likely to be effective. So what are our alternatives? When we think about other parts of the UN system that provides a key plank of what the UK can do, are the SDGs going to deliver? Certainly not on time, but are they actually going to deliver overall? How do we engage with development, upskilling, resourcing across vast parts of the region, Laos, Cambodia, and other places, Myanmar, if we don't have that UN framework to bolt our story into? So what do we do? And what are the implications for the tools that are available to us to do that? And we need to tell better stories about what we do. One of the things that I have been increasingly frustrated by is that the story of the Indo-Pacific, or the story of the UK in the Indo-Pacific, seems to be boiled down into a checklist of, we sent our aircraft carrier, we've become an ASEAN dialogue partner, we've done all of these things. What's the follow-on? What's the story? What's the positive story of how we engaged with ASEAN as a dialogue partner that achieved substantive goals and change for people in the region and for people in the UK? There are good stories to be told, but we're not telling them. So how can we turn this around? And I'm not going to leave you with absolutely nothing, although I am going to be quiet soon. Because I work in a university, obviously I'm going to tell you that education is a fundamental tool to achieve all of these things. So I would do things like double the number of Chevening scholars that we support, double the number of global talent visas to bring inspiring, innovative, creative talent to the UK that diversify all of our classrooms and bring different ideas and stories to the table. I would go back and look at early years curriculum in the UK, go back through primary schools, go back through secondary schools, and begin to tell an honest story about the UK as a colonial power in the region. But also begin to tell the stories of different languages across the whole sweep, so that when people go to the region, they can talk to people, they can engage with people. That goes back to my time frame for delivering on the UK and the Indo-Pacific. If I'm talking about primary school age children now, I'm thinking about what the UK can do in 2030, 2040, 2050. So it's a long-term project, and that means that it needs to be a cross-party project. It needs to sweep across political divides, and that's why we need to tell better stories. We need to have a deep-rooted understanding in the region, which I think is a slight quote from Astrid earlier this morning. And so what does the UK in the region look like? John, in your comments earlier, you used the phrase, I might have written it down wrong, a lattice of cooperation. The UK needs to be the linkages between the lattice spokes in the region. And that needs to be across not just traditional topics, but climate resilience, greening supply chains, humanitarian assistance, disaster response, key topics around security, including Myanmar, North Korea, and all of these other places where we have traditional expertise. And we need to be building the empathy across all levels of society in order to achieve all of these things. And I'll be quiet.
Great. Thank you all three for very, very interesting and stimulating remarks. Before we open it up to the whole floor, let me just ask a couple of questions of the set of everyone here. But first I'll make a quick comment, which is that on that last point about the teaching of languages, I have noticed, to my chagrin, that Southeast Asian languages are not taught anywhere in this university, and very, very few universities in the UK are offering them at all, so as that had for many, many years been a world leader in the teaching and learning of Southeast Asian languages is cutting many of them. And I don't see many signs of green shoots in that regard across the country. So there's a major issue there. South Asian languages, by the way, are not in a much better state. Right? There's a very limited and shrinking teaching of South Asian languages. So it's absolutely essential to invest in those, I would just say as a little editorial aside, for the country as a whole and for individual universities in particular. Before anything else, let me also then just say this Indo-Pacific tilt idea, which is something I would say the current government has not handled very well, in that it looks suspiciously like a 2 a.m. inebriated wobble, rather than a conscientious turn towards anything else, maybe even a wobble by an elephant in high heels. But it's after drinking too much, those barrels of ale or whatever that they get into. So, this needs a stabilization. And it strikes me that to stabilize the Indo-Pacific tilt, a differentiated strategy is called for. And some of that we've heard a little bit about, but I'd ask all three panelists maybe to say, how would you differentiate that across kind of four broad regions? First, we've got kind of Japan and Korea, then China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, then Southeast Asia, i.e. the ASEAN countries, and then South Asia and the Indian Ocean. You know, if we're going to think of the Indo-Pacific as a whole and the tilt towards it, what would you do in each of those regions to stabilize and direct more pointedly this Indo-Pacific tilt, which I think has not been very specific? And the second thing I'll ask to all three panelists, and I know that each of you has a sort of a different angle of coming at this, so I'm very curious to hear what you have to say. I think that the UK has a very special role and responsibility when it comes to Hong Kong. And I say that not only due to colonial legacy, I mean, there's lots of colonial legacies around the region, but specifically because the principle of one country, two systems, which many have felt in the last 5 or 6 years has been so badly abrogated, is rooted in the Sino-British Joint Declaration rather than actually in the basic law of Hong Kong. It's due to an agreement that the UK and China made over the status of Hong Kong without any consultation of Hong Kongers, as far as I know from either side, a long time ago. And because of that, this is something I think actually the current government has handled rather better than the general Indo-Pacific tilt, and reasonably well in my estimation, in terms of how to react to what's been going on in Hong Kong. But I'd ask each of our three panelists, what do you think the UK could or should do to respond to the situation in Hong Kong and to manage the relationship with China and with other states in the region in regards to the Hong Kong ongoing set of questions? Thanks. You can take those in any order that
So I have to start by defending government, obviously. So I don't know, perhaps someone in government, I'm looking at some officials in the audience here, was reading Sun Tzu Bingfa, and The Art of War, and this is all strategic ambiguity, which looks like being drunk at 2 a.m. The first set of questions I thought was quite interesting. You're kind of steering my thinking as if we're making kind of policy on the hoof here. But if you look at East Asia and you take Korea and the Republic of Korea and Japan specifically as very developed economies, and perhaps there is something in again thinking to the CPTPP with Korea in that, along with in the future along with Japan. In the UK, perhaps there's more potential there for economic growth. So looking at a key kind of UK interest in that regard. I think if I look at, I think you said South Asia as well, and if you didn't, I'm going to say South Asia anyway. But South Asia, what's quite interesting, even if you look at my constituency, so I've got one of the largest Indian Muslim communities in the United Kingdom, Gujarati Muslim community, makes up about 17% of Bolton Northeast. I've also got quite a large Pakistani British community as well. So roughly 20%, 1/5 of my constituency has links into South Asia. And it's something when I'm out and about in the constituency and meeting with businesses, especially Gujarati business people, is oftentimes I would say to them, am I just stereotyping because you're from ethnic minority background that you'll have a link to South Asia, but 9 times out of 10 people will say there's still strong linkages there. They still travel a lot to the region, especially in Surat and Barachi, two kind of large village town cities in Gujarat as well. So I think diaspora would be an interesting angle when it comes to South Asia. And then also, I think a lot of people have pushed back on this in recent years, saying India's the next China. Perhaps there isn't another China of the China 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago in that massive scale of growth. But I think looking at the economic potential that there is between the growth in India and the United Kingdom would be quite interesting. You then said, I think, so China, mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. I mean, I think it's in China's interest. It's in everyone's interest for Hong Kong to be successful, as it is for Taiwan as well. I think it's also in the West's interest for mainland China to do well, to succeed economically, for it to be stable. So anything that we can do, I think sometimes it's an issue of tone, because even when we travelled there a couple of months ago and we made to Beijing, whenever we made some sort of statements from our side, is that perhaps at times the Chinese side can get a little bit sort of tetchy with the approach, because they may think that the UK were being condescending or talking down to them. So I think that the tone's quite important. It doesn't necessarily mean that the intent or the sorts of things that we're talking about is necessarily changed, but I think it's just how we try to get across those things. So perhaps someone like myself coming from Northern Ireland, or anyone from Scotland, or the Celtic fringes in the audience, is to look at how the United Kingdom has had to try and deal with diversity or different nations within the United Kingdom, and how to try and keep a happy family, which isn't always happy. Sometimes it can be very unhappy. But it's, what are the methods, what are the institutions and policies do we use in order to try and keep things together? And I think perhaps there is some wisdom in that, in the setup of the UK, and perhaps when mainland China is looking at its relations with different entities in its wider region also. So that's why I would look at those three. I forget the last question, William, was more on Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, there's a humongous amount of potential there. I think recently we've had an increase in interest in Indonesia. The Indonesian ambassador came to Parliament about three or 4 weeks ago, and it was quite interesting talking with him, one-to-one, where he kind of felt that the level of understanding of Indonesia in the United Kingdom was incredibly low. There was so much more, and I know there's a lot of Indonesian experts in the audience here, including Ben, a name check there towards the back of the room. And I think there's a sense that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. It's massive population. Indonesia, again, one of the world's largest Muslim majority country also. So more perhaps that we could be doing there. And the funny thing was, last weekend I went to the playoff final between Bolton Wanderers and Oxford United. And when I looked up, kind of the part of the stadium I was sat in, and I could see the Indonesian ambassador there, and then I saw the Thai ambassador, and I was like, well, it's all the ambassadors been invited to this today for some reason, because they couldn't sell out the tickets for some reason on the Oxford United side. And but no, it turns out that Oxford United, you guys probably know this, but it's owned by a kind of consortium of different business interests in Indo-Pacific. So there's a potential there for a case study for any academics here.
Anything on Hong Kong?
Yeah, so on Hong Kong, I think again it's what I was saying there about how the United Kingdom and our experiences has dealt with differences, and I think that's something. When I look at Hong Kong, I think that Beijing over the last two plus decades, potentially where it struggled vis-a-vis its relation with Hong Kong, is that it obviously hasn't had the same experience of dealing in a democratic environment that the United Kingdom has had, and the kind of a free press and the constant scrutiny. And again, I do think that more could be done there, because at the end of the day, like I said, it's in everyone's interest that Hong Kong is economically incredibly successful. And we still have, obviously, we publish reports, I think, still every 6 months into the situation in Hong Kong, and we continue in the House of Commons take a huge interest in it. There's still a lot of debates, actually, and I think last week, the week before, we had a debate on China policy, and Hong Kong was a major element of that also.
Cool. Bill, you're playing tricks. Now we have homework. Okay. I think it's interesting that you've divided up the Indo-Pacific, but it kind of goes against the whole point of Indo-Pacific, which is supposed to be a singular strategy, right? And I think a key, while there are concerns to be raised, I agree with you about the idea of the Indo-Pacific tilt, because it's a grand strategy with, it's kind of shallow. And so looking at it at the 4 different regions is quite an interesting approach. The problem becomes a matter of it ends up leading to inconsistencies in foreign policy as a whole, because we will engage with certain countries or certain regions or certain economies in a certain way. Let's just say, I'm not going to name any country, but negatively, say on the issue of human rights. But when other countries are in a similar position, all in the Indo-Pacific, we will not call them out for that exact same point, right? And it leads to significant inconsistencies when it comes to how the international system is working. There's been a lot of criticism about how we in the West have been working, say, for the last 7 to 10 years on the internet when it comes to international norms and regulations, particularly in the area of human rights, where we will call out, apply sanctions, et cetera, in some cases, but not in others. And that inconsistency ends up actually undermining and devaluing what is at the foundation of what the neoliberal system is. The rules and the regulations which for decades we've been trying to establish, right? Now, I'm not trying to dodge your question. I think the issue becomes a matter of there are things that in each of the 4 areas need to be established consistently as a whole first before we can adapt to specific bilateral kind of engagement, okay? The one key way that we can obviously engage with Japan and Korea, well, I mean, going back to what Kath said, when it comes to the issue of the Korean Peninsula flashpoint, like not maintaining our knowledge and our legacy and our capacity in that area is highly problematic. It demonstrates a certain level of it's not a matter of being a fair weather interest in that, but it undermines our own capacity as the UK. And we can't just, we ultimately want to have more of an independent foreign policy where in certain instances we may follow along with our key ally to the west. But there are times when we don't agree. And there are times when we cannot remain in the same bed, and we can't put all our eggs into that one basket, right? And so Japan is obviously a very close ally, and there's obviously a very strong bond there that actually could be utilized far more, I think, than just kind of like checklists and photo ops. I'm not taking a shot at anyone. There is significant contributions to be made and to utilize with Japan. And when it comes to South Korea as well, I think that's an area where we do historically have a role to play, particularly when it came to the 6-party talks, but it's just kind of petered out a bit. And I'm not an expert in Korea, but Kath is, so let's ask her. In the area of China and Taiwan, as I said previously, our China policy is not clear, and there's lots of inconsistencies, and it leads to a lot of mistrust, miscommunication, and misunderstanding. That's highly problematic if you're trying to implement any kind of foreign policy and achieve anything in that area, right? It also can raise questions for those who, like Taiwan, who can be quite a close ally with the UK, but not just for Taiwan, but for other economies and other nation states, about the extent to which the UK is consistent in its values and consistent in its foreign policy and how you would, as a partner or as a strategic ally, okay? I will jump to the last question about Hong Kong, and I will get to the ASEAN, and after that is, when it comes to Hong Kong, I think I understand why the UK obviously has a vested interest in Hong Kong and how it's governed. I think what needs to happen is we need to leave our ego at the door, because there are ways to engage on the issue of Hong Kong without going into saying, do you know who I am? Do you know how important I am? because all the immigration officers have to do is reject, deport, right? It doesn't get you anywhere, right? And ultimately playing on a level field, saying we're equal and let's have a proper discussion, has more scope for success, or more scope for dialogue that in the long run may help pay off. Okay. With regards to ASEAN, there's so much opportunity with ASEAN. And I think we, generally speaking, have quite a good relationship with a lot of the ASEAN nations. I think the problem is it's like we see the European Union, it's just the European Union. It's just this one thing, but it's not, because it's 10 countries, right? And they're so diverse, culturally, historically, even economically, but they are so important for us with regards to our supply chains. And so there is a lot of scope when it comes to reinforcing and kind of rebuilding the legitimacy of the multilateral system that the UK can play when it comes to engaging that and rebuilding trust within the free trade system, and rebuilding trust within the multilateral system that the UK could have a contribution to make. With regards to South Asia and the Indian Ocean, we get along really well with Australia, right? So we get along really well with New Zealand. And the Pacific Islands, that's a whole other issue that I really don't want to touch. There's a lot of history there with the Commonwealth and stuff like that. So you can do that if you want to. But when it comes to South Asia, that's far more complicated, I think. I would say because the US has such a large finger in the pie, it becomes problematic in terms of having any kind of major influence. That being said, the issue of consistency remains, that when it comes to our central values and norms, we need to be consistent in calling out things that need to be called out, but building what can be built and what needs to be built. So I hedging my bets there. Thanks.
So I'm going to try and be really brief because I don't have very many answers to your questions, Bill. One of the things that I think I would echo Winnie's point is that if the Indo-Pacific is a region that has to be engaged with, then why should our first step be to break it down into sub-regions or individual states? So either we have an Indo-Pacific strategy that is encompassing of a whole space, or we have a Southeast Asian strategy, or we have. So I think I would reinforce Winnie's point. Having said that, I'm now going to do the exact opposite and say, with Japan and Korea, I would defer to some of the Japan and Korea experts in the room. But one of the things that I think is coming rapidly over the hill are things like population crises. We also have a population crisis that is coming around the hill. We should probably be talking together about these things. And that doesn't have to be a foreign policy dynamic. That can be perfectly healthcare system to healthcare system. Not everything has to land in the bucket of foreign affairs or geostrategy, and probably shouldn't. And actually, maybe we should be saying we have relationships across multiple levels with multiple different parties that is very useful, but that doesn't mean that everything should be put into the geopolitical or geostrategic bucket. And we should draw better lines around what's in and what's out. I would also say that Japan and Korea, I think, as the first panel this morning mentioned, also have significant issues between themselves that occasionally flare up. I don't think the UK has a role to be getting in the middle of those. And so I think I would reinforce, and Winnie said we should leave our ego at the door. We should probably not knock on the door either. And I think that's important. With respect to Southeast Asia in particular, I was in Vietnam in February, and somebody said something very important to me, which is China's relationship with Vietnam covers at least 3 levels: state to state, party to party, people to people. we can't go anywhere near the party to party. It doesn't mean we can't do more on the people to people and the state to state. But we need to do all of that with eyes wide open. And a similar type of narrative could be developed in relation to Laos and Cambodia and other places. And I think we need to have that very clearly envisioned when looking at Southeast Asia, that there's so much diversity across Southeast Asia that we can talk about an ASEAN conversation, and then we can talk about individual bilateral relationships. But maybe it doesn't make sense to have a sort of all of Southeast Asia bucket. And I think I would go back to what I said earlier. We can do a lot more in terms of building more Turing links, in sending more students from the UK to go and spend a month in different institutions and universities across all of Southeast Asia. That then needs to be supported with insurance and all of these other things. But it's about building those people-to-people links. I think we can do vastly more in terms of early warning systems, scientific collaborations around when tsunamis happen, where to reposition and engage with and make villages, cities, towns, roads, infrastructure more resilient to the climate that happens now, but the climate that's going to increasingly happen in 50 years' time. When I was in Australia in the summer, I was told something very interesting that may or may not still be true. When the new administration came to power in Australia, one of the most important things was that they stopped talking to every partner just about China. They went to the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and say, what do you want us to talk about? Because Australia had been dominated by this, everything for us is about China, and therefore everything we talk about to you is about China. But that might not be the crocodile closest to their canoe. And we need to have a better understanding about what is the biggest fear for each of these states, or what is the biggest challenge that they're facing. And those are going to be monumentally different across all of these different spaces that we call the Indo-Pacific. And I would say one of the spaces we haven't talked about is the Russian border in the Indo-Pacific, and we might not want to go there today. But you can't now talk about North Korea without talking about Russia. You can't envision solutions to North Korea without thinking about what does this play with in the Russian context or in relation to Russia-China relations. And so making the conversation useful also depends on setting the parameters right to do so.
Great, thank you very much for even more interesting and in-depth answers to those questions. Let's open it up to the floor. There's a number of questions, so I'm not sure of the correct order. Why don't we start from the back and work across the back and then back this way. So, Janani, if you want to take Ian Chong first, and then go across the back and then this way. So I see there's so many hands up. So yes, go ahead.
Terima kasih untuk mempromosi bahasa-bahasa Asia Tenggara, Encik Bill. Actually, I'm really glad to hear a discussion about history because I think one of the things with engagement in the Indo-Pacific for the UK is that you come with baggage, for better or worse, right? And it's not just the colonial history of occupation, but also with a lot of some of the laws that places in the Indo-Pacific have inherited. Hong Kong, for instance, with the sedition law, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia too, that have been used to repress. Jadi pertanyaan saya. Okay, so the question I do have to ask is, coming from Southeast Asia, sometimes when we engage with people from the UK, the FCO does a wonderful job, but the question is not a matter of capability, it's not a matter of commitment, the question is relevance. What does the UK bring in terms of relevance today? That's a real question. I'm sorry if it sounds rude, but that is a real question. And the other question that I hope that you'd all be able to address a little bit is you've all talked about engagement with ASEAN. Sure, that's important, but I think in Southeast Asia at least, there's a lot more skepticism about the future of ASEAN. So if you look at the State of Southeast Asia survey done every year by the ISIS Southeast Asia Institute, it's like 70 to 80% of people think that, well, this is an elite survey, but elites in Southeast Asia think that ASEAN needs a major revamp. We're not sure where it's going. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on sort of where you position in the UK, ASEAN, and how you think about engagement with ASEAN as opposed to the other Southeast Asian states. Thanks. Sorry.
Just work across the back first. We'll take 3 or 4 questions, at least as a bank, and then we'll take probably another round.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, all of you, to varying extent, have basically said the current government or successive governments of the UK have not been doing a very good job, in engaging the region, and you have outlined, various options on how to, do a better job. I mean, why is it that the UK repeatedly not do a good job then? And to what extent are your, grand visions implementable realistically, in light of our current government and also in light of, changes that we have to expect coming up soon? Thank you.
Hi, yeah. I just wanted to maybe sharpen some of what Winnie was saying a little bit more implicitly in terms of India. And specifically in terms of a couple of different things. I mean, firstly, you've all probably heard of the idea that India is now assassinating Canadian citizens within Canada, and they tried to do the same thing in the United States. And because of the Five Eyes cooperation, that sort of means something for a sort of a larger community of the liberal order. And of course, we're right in the middle of an election period, but it's really dire. There are lots of really negative sort of signs about victimization, about the undermining of institutions like the Electoral Commission, as well as vilification of minorities, that I think complicate the idea that India is a norms and values-based ally. Coupled with, and this is what Wasim Ahmed was talking about too, is that the assumption that India would be the great market because China is complicated, India is a democracy, India is a much better market, is complicated also by the Modi regime by a sort of strategy that does 2 things that we don't like. One is sort of a very kind of internally neo-mercantilist sort of spending a lot of money on rent-seeking to a number of really key firms in terms of infrastructure development, especially, which is really, it does create great infrastructure, but it actually really discriminates against a lot of small and medium enterprises, and really complicates this idea that the great British trade agreement with India was going to go forward, because increasingly there's a lot of people who are not sort of benefiting hugely from that. So in part, I would ask Mark, but I mean in general, just to ask the panel, talking about like the idea that India has been incorporated into the Indo-Pacific as a way of increasing allies in a kind of an anti-China club that the US was trying to put together, seems to be not productive, especially with the UK, especially as Mark was saying, so many complicated, much larger diaspora communities, not just Pakistani and Gujarati Muslim, but also Gujarati Hindu, and a lot of those people are, there's a lot of support for Modi, but also Bangladeshi communities and things like that. So is there a way of maybe hiving off this Indo-Pacific strategy to create a kind of a more kind of engaged and neutral way of looking at South Asia? Anyway, sorry.
Thank you. We'll take 2 from this side. quickly, and then we'll let the panelists answer these briefly.
Thanks. I'm Dan Chugg. I'm a director in the Foreign Office for Northeast Asia and China. So I'd like to put a slightly alternative point of view to the fact that the government's rubbish and the IP tilt has been an alcoholic elephant at 2 o'clock in the morning. If we can just sort of look at sort of political, economic, and security issues. I cover Northeast Asia, so I'll sort of concentrate mainly on that. But on the political side, yes, we've become an ASEAN dialogue partner status, and I think that we are working better with ASEAN. And I think that means that we embrace ASEAN centrality and have been more humble and listening more in that region. And that's my experience as a diplomat, that I think we're doing that. But I think in Northeast Asia, the bilateral relationships have really improved. We've put more resources into our embassies and more staff. But if you look at something like the relationship with Japan and South Korea, where we've got the Hiroshima Accords with Japan and the Downing Street Accords with South Korea, which are really very broad and deep. And I think, Katherine, this is sort of more than your tick list. This is hopefully the narrative that underpins it, which is a range of dialogues, MOUs, discussions, agreements, partnerships on a massive number of subjects, from cyber to AI to global development to food to resources to sort of any number of space, the Arctic. So sort of you can list them, and this is a sort of a depth of relationship we've not had with countries in that region before, which is actually, I think, hugely important to as part of that slow burn, long-term relationships. And it's not just in Northeast Asia. I think India as well, Indonesia, Malaysia. We're seeing a depth and breadth which we've not had before. On the economic side, yes, CPTPP is on our checklist. But in addition to that, there's real work going on to build economic ties in a meaningful way and to promote business and promote ties between business. And again, the two countries that I mentioned last year, when the Prime Minister went to Japan, we had £18 billion worth of deals. When we had the South Korean state visit here, we had £22 billion worth of deals. £40 billion, that's a lot of money from just two countries. And I think that that is also an example where we are putting effort and resource into building economic ties for the benefit of the UK and for the benefit of the region. And on security, we might have a couple of ships floating around on a permanent basis, which we've not had before. But actually, AUKUS and GCAP are substantial, generational-long, multi-billion-pound projects which will embed the UK in that region in a security way and a security partnership which we've not had before. AUKUS is extremely meaningful in terms of our relationships with the UK and with the US and with Australia. But more than that, it's something which other countries would like to be part of because they see that its benefits in terms of research and capability and sharing of information and knowledge, as well as having a military capability. And GCAP, I think, is the most extraordinary program, the Global Combat Air Program, which is really a 50-year program with Japan. We've never done anything like that with any country outside of Five Eyes and EU before. And so to be putting that sort of investment into not procuring aircraft, but developing with Japan an entirely new generation of aircraft system is something which we've not really conceived before. So I think actually it's a little unfair to say that this is shallow or that we haven't done very much. I think actually these are quite profound differences in the way that we've approached the region with real concrete aspects that we've put in these various different elements. And then lastly, this is a grand strategy, which the British government doesn't very often do and doesn't often do very well. But I think there's a lot of aspects to it which have been coherent and joined up. And of course, the bit which is left unsaid throughout all of this is the China bit. And sometimes we're asked, is the Indo-Pacific tilt about China or is it about the rest of the Indo-Pacific? And to which I say yes. Because it is, of course, about China. It's about building the resilience of the partnerships around China. It's about helping countries to understand our perspective. It's certainly about helping us understand other countries' perspective. And again, from the listening point of view, we recognize that the countries in the region know far more about China than we're ever going to do because they are China's neighbors and they've been dealing with the issues of China for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so part of it is for us to go to that region and, we might not be very relevant, but we've got something to learn. And I think part of all of this grand strategy is all about that. So thank you.
Thanks. I think Brendan gets the last question of this round, and then we'll take another round if there's time.
Thank you very much. Very interesting panel. I'm Brendan Sims. I'm the director of the centre, and I'm absolutely not an expert on Indo-Pacific. I'm a European historian. But, and actually my question really arises, is to do with Europe and follows what Mark was saying about the possible shift back to Europe, after an election. And what I was really wanting to suggest is that the two areas, of course, are very closely linked. Katherine touched on this briefly with the fact that, of course, Russia is a player. But if you look at what the Japanese have been saying, Prime Minister Kishida talking about Ukraine today, could be East Asia tomorrow, they clearly see the link. South Korea supplying all those artillery shells. They very much see these areas as connected. And when I ask South Korean and Japanese diplomats or analysts or politicians, given the fact that UK resources are limited, would you not much rather that we concentrated on Europe, relieving the Americans to do more in East Asia, which would be a logical thing to do? And they invariably say, no, we would like to have the UK engaged because we see this as one space. So my question really is, should this be really conceptualized more? That it's not, the tilt is not just about, turning a back on Europe and approaching East Asia or the Indo-Pacific. It's about seeing the two challenges, which are obviously the PRC and the Russian Federation, in a joined-up way. I just wonder what the panel would have to say about that.
Okay, let's allow our panelists to answer all of these tremendously diverse points on the floor first, and then if there's time, we'll take one more round.
Okay, I'll try to be very, 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 very quick. So, Dan, funny, so I'm putting you on the spot here, but after you finished all that, I was thinking I'm going to edit that speech and at the end say vote Conservatives, because it was the best pitch I could possibly have for my election. I've done a crap job in comparison, so thank you for that, Dan. The first speaker from NUS, I think, and you'd kind of mentioned relevance was the word you used. I thought it was incredibly interesting because there was a lady, I think, on the far right here of the room also was touching upon that. And if I make it into domestic politics, if all politics is domestic, I mean, I think for my constituents, for 68 million people across the UK, is that we have to make the Indo-Pacific tilt or international relations relevant in some way. And that's something over the last 4 years when I've spoken with high commissioners and ambassadors for us that are based overseas, I've often said, when you come back to the UK, come and speak like public diplomacy within our own country. Come and speak with constituents, tell us about what you're doing in Islamabad or what you're doing in Karachi or wherever else. And I think we have to show to our own constituents in the UK the benefit of that. And that's, Katherine, I think also come back to what you've said about telling a story of some sort, not just doing a checklist, because a lot of times when politicians, when we get up and we say, £38 billion or these massive figures, that it can feel quite meaningless to people. It doesn't feel tangible enough. So both the benefit to a UK domestic audience, but also to our audiences across the Indo-Pacific also is like making the case about why the UK is relevant. And it was something earlier on, I was jotting this down, that idea of perception, what is the UK's perception amongst Asia-Pacific countries? And I thought, in Eurovision, the UK, the music competition that's held every year, the UK oftentimes doesn't perform very well, and we're very disappointed. We're like, does this mean our music's not great, or is it because people don't like us? Is it a soft power thing? And I was thinking, if there was an Asia Vision, how would the UK get on in Asia Vision? And I thought, maybe I've been a bit naive, but I thought we might do actually quite well, because a lot of times, and Dan will know this, in China, when the British Council and other Monocle or whatever those other soft power indices were kind of carrying out research, oftentimes the UK would be placed top 3, top 4 in countries amongst Chinese people. Usually Germany's number 1 because Siemens and Mercedes and BMW could be seen everywhere. But then France would score quite well. But we would oftentimes do really well. We'd be number 3, we'd be number 2. And I think that sort of goodwill would be felt amongst quite a few countries in Asia Pacific also. And so what can we do to sort of leverage that a bit more, that we have a foot in the door? It's your point actually you made about being a guest earlier on, vis-a-vis, how do you become a homeowner at some point? And I do think that we have that goodwill, but it's what we do now in the next 10, 20, 30 years that can make that better. The other one, just the gentleman had asked the question around, I suppose, consistency when it comes to how we conduct international relations. And I do think we have to be careful sometimes, because in recent weeks and months, again, my constituents take a massive interest in Gaza and the Middle East, and I have seen some polling amongst Southeast Asian countries where perceptions of some countries in the West has declined because of what's been happening in different policy stances over the last 7 or 8 months. So I do think that we have to be consistent, and that if it is based on values, agenda, and or ideology, is that we have to, as much as possible, make it a one size fits all. Otherwise, those who are being cynical will say, well, it's not about ideology, it's about power and about realism.
Thank you. Okay, I'm not an expert in India, so I like what Mark said. Yeah. I'm Canadian, so I totally get what you're saying. I also find there's a certain level of disturbingness. It's disturbing to have such little response to such activities. But then it makes you wonder, when the tides change, as geopolitics does, how that will come back to haunt us. I think the key thing that I find very interesting is the question of, what does the UK bring to the table? Particularly for all the numerous countries that we're talking about, the numerous economies that we're talking about. And I think that my students hate this answer. It depends. Yeah, it depends, because it becomes a matter of, if we are willing to leave our egos at the door, every single country, every single economy that we're talking about needs different things. Their specializations are different. And the opportunities that exist or potentially exist are different, right? And so, in terms of what I would say, if we're just going to identify across the board something the UK can bring to the table, it's very much, and I think I mentioned it when we first started. It's very much about how, and I had a chat with Dan earlier today about it as well, is that there has been a paradigm shift within the international system, where we've moved away from a very strong US superpower kind of hegemon-led system that is dominated by multilateral institutions, and global South voices tend to be overshadowed or drowned out. And we're currently in a system where that's starting to shift. Whether that means it's because China's big enough that it is able to ensure that it is heard, and therefore other global South powers and rising powers see that as an opportunity to say, like, well, you know what? Now there's room, and therefore we want to be heard as well. What it definitely means, however, is that the US has shifted its foreign policy towards something that's far more protectionist in nature, far more neo-mercantilist in nature, obviously much more about national security and domestic concerns, where the multilateral system really has a bit of a vacuum where I think the UK can fill and step into. The free trade neoliberal system has provided an environment where, and we haven't mentioned it a lot on this panel, but where China has grown and been able to develop the way it has, fundamentally because of the system that we have, right? And while they do definitely want to have a bigger voice at the table and to be heard, that system does provide a level of stability which they actually find very attractive. It would not necessarily be in the West's interest to allow them to have full run of the table. And so the UK has scope for being a player which will remind us about the traditional norms and values which led to the establishment of the institutions and the international system that we have now, and can hold rising powers to account, because rising powers, remember, don't have a lot of experience when it comes to major diplomatic brouhahas, be it war, major global recessions, etc. And so I think the UK could definitely have a role to play with that area, if I was going to identify something.
All right. Ian Chong, what does the UK bring in terms of relevance? I don't think it's an easy answer, but I think there are many things that it can potentially bring. I think one of them is being a significant node in the wider world of innovation, creativity, and economic foresight. That comes down to engaging directly and bilaterally with all of the sites, businesses, trading links across the whole of the Indo-Pacific in order to maximize that, not just for the UK, but for every partner that you engage with. I think the UK still has a significant global presence in terms of following the rules, following the international rules-based order. If we want everybody else to respect them, then we play a significant role in following them ourselves. And I would say that there have been significant question marks over the last 5 or so years as to whether the UK has held its line on that. And so if it wants to continue to be relevant in upholding what we're now calling the rules-based international order, then it needs to recommit itself to being subject to those same rules. That's, I think, a significant chunk of its relevance. The skepticism of ASEAN. Now, I am an ASEAN hugger in general. But one of the best things I was told about ASEAN was ASEAN can be best described as a multi-lane highway. And you have to move at the same speed as the rest of the highway. If everybody else comes to a screeching halt, you also have to stop. If everyone is barreling along at 50 miles an hour, you move at 50 miles an hour. And one of the things that I think is more complicated in engaging with ASEAN as an organization is understanding that it doesn't move consistently at the same speed all the time over every issue, and that it is powered more or less by the state that wants to move the slowest. That, for me, means this goes back to the UK's engagement with ASEAN, as with the rest of the Indo-Pacific, is about being consistent, being present, engaging, listening, doing all of these things. And that's not what makes a news headline. That's not what makes a good pitch for your election. But it is what demonstrates the UK as an engaged, consistent actor in the region. That isn't the whole story. The UK still needs to do all of the bilateral relationships, and it still needs to be understanding each individual state, grouping, community on their own terms. Olivia, why is it the UK has not done a good job? Well, if I agree with Dan, I would go back to my original point of it hasn't told a story about the good job it has done. It has done, we've got GCAP, we've got AUKUS, we've done this, we've done this. It hasn't told a compelling story as to why what it has done has helped communities here in the UK and in Singapore, in Indonesia, in Japan, in South Korea. It hasn't told the story. So if you agree that the UK has done a good job, it hasn't sold it well, but you might also want to say it hasn't been able to sell it well because it hasn't done a good job. Now, I'll leave it up to you to decide where you sit on that line. I sit very firmly on one part of it. Dan. So one of the things I would say is, the reason we got to GCAP is because of the decade of diplomacy, of slow institutional building up of relationships with partners in Japan, but also on the Italian side of things, that enabled it to happen. It wasn't that suddenly somebody had an idea and we've achieved it in the space of a few years. It was only possible, from my view, because of all of that legwork that had gone in before. And I think one of my biggest problems with the sort of Indo-Pacific tilt is that it assumes that all of that basis is there consistently for every state, and it wasn't. So what we've been able to achieve with Japan or with some other states is maybe testament to the long enduring process of diplomacy and engagement that pre-existed it, not necessarily the announcement thereof, would be my answer. With AUKUS, I think a lot still is to be proven with AUKUS. I remember going around having a lot of conversations in Australia about AUKUS, and I can literally go from one room where somebody told me AUKUS is the best thing since Queen Elizabeth, whatever, and then I go to another meeting and somebody would say AUKUS is going to be the misleading entity of the rest of the world and it's going to drive us all astray and it's not what Australia needs. And so I think the proof of AUKUS is still waiting, right? I've seen an awful lot written about it. I've seen a lot of discussions about what it is and what it's going to achieve and what it's going to do. I still think the proof of the pudding's in the eating with AUKUS. And we might have to just agree to disagree on that until we've got some more evidence about what it actually gets to. And I think the two prongs of AUKUS are the submarine part and then the intellectual exchange part. I think the submarines will get all of the attention. I think the actual proof of AUKUS is going to be in the other parts of the agreement. Brendan, I think this goes back to, I'm going to sort of slightly swing back to Winnie's previous point around this, of we talk about the Indo-Pacific, but how relevant is it as a concept for framing any of the other diplomacy or other conversations? And I think it's useful, but I think it's political rather than conceptual. And so maybe it's helpful in sort of talking about certain things and certain ideas in certain groups of people, but when it comes down to it, maybe it's not that helpful because it draws barriers where we don't necessarily want barriers in terms of understanding relationships. Japan, Russia, South Korea, Ukraine, all of these other places, it draws barriers and sort of includes and excludes different pockets of expertise, which may or may not be helpful. But then it triggers other conversations. So I sort of think use with care around the sort of concept of the Indo-Pacific.
I'm delighted to report that we're exactly on time. And unfortunately, that means there's no time for another round of questions because waiting for us in the court and in the building opposite is a drinks reception to which all of you are, of course, invited. So thank you all very, very much for staying with us throughout the long afternoon. Thank you for your questions and your participation. And please thank our panelists as well for all of their incredibly illuminating remarks.